A pregnant woman collapsed at his barn door at dusk, whispering, "I have nothing left." The boards on that barn door had been splitting along the bottom rail since August, and I kept meaning to get to them. That's the thing I remember first, not the sound she made when she went down, not the way the light was falling long and copper across the yard. The splitting board. I'd been staring at it for a week, telling myself I'd nail it before winter set hard, and then there was a woman on the ground in front of it, and I forgot about the board for a good long while. I heard something. That's what pulled me out of the stall where I was watering the gray. Not a voice, not a thud, just a change in the air outside, the way the yard gets when something crosses it. 40 years of ranching teaches a man to hear that without knowing he's hearing it. You learn to feel the difference between the weight of the ordinary and the weight of something wrong. I set down the water bucket and stood still for a moment in the smell of hay and horse and damp straw, just listening. Then I came around the door frame slow, the way you do when you're not young anymore and your hip talks to you in cold weather. And there she was, face down in the dirt, both hands pressed flat to the ground like she'd tried to catch herself, and the ground had just kept on going. Her dress was dark at the hem. She'd been walking through wet ground for a while. Her hair was loose, and there was dried mud on the back of her neck. She wasn't moving, but I could see her breathing, the slow labor of it, shallow and tight. The first thing I did was look past her. Old habit. You learn not to look at only the thing on the ground. You check what's behind it, what's around the corner, what direction it came from. The lane was empty. The hills to the east were pulling the last of the light, going purple at the edges. No horse, no wagon, no one else. I was alone with whatever this was. I went to my knees beside her. I put 2 fingers to the side of her neck, not because I doubted what I could see, but because it's what you do. Strong pulse. I looked at her hands, a ring on her left hand, thin gold, worn, and her belly. She was holding her belly with one arm, even face down, even unconscious. That told me more than anything else. I said, "Ma'am," not loud, just enough for her to hear. She turned her head. It took a moment. Her face was streaked with dust and dried tears and something else, the flat blankness that comes after a person has used up everything they had. Not despair exactly, not grief, something quieter than both. Emptied out. She looked at me and I could tell she wasn't entirely sure what she was seeing. She said, so quiet I almost missed it, "I have nothing left." That was all. I don't know if she meant it as an explanation or an apology. Maybe both. Maybe she was just saying what was true and she was too worn to care whether anyone listened. I said, "All right." That was all I said back. I got one arm under her shoulders and one under her knees and I lifted her. She was heavier than I expected, the weight of the child adding to her, the weight of however many miles she'd covered, and my back said something rude about it, but I got her up. She didn't fight me. She pressed her face against my shoulder like a tired child who's been trying to stay awake past all reason and has finally given up. I carried her inside. My name is Elias Cord. I'm 63 years old. I've been running this ranch alone since my wife, Caroline, died 11 years ago. It's not a big spread, 440 acres, more grass than anything, a small herd I manage myself most of the year. I bring a boy on for calving in April, and sometimes one again in late summer for the cutting. But the rest of the time, it's just me. 440 acres and a man, and whatever the weather decides to be. I want you to understand what that life is, because it matters for what happened next. It's a life of mornings starting before light and evenings ending late. A life where you eat what you cook and you cook what's quick, because the thing that needs doing after supper is only slightly less than what needed doing before it. It's a life where you know every fence post on the property, where every one of them is in the rotation, when it was last checked, whether the wire is rusting at the base. You carry all of it in your head because there's no one else to carry it with you. The herd knows your voice better than any person does, and you know their faces and their habits and their particular sounds the way some men know their children. I'm not saying that to be sad about it. I chose this life. Caroline and I built it together from a bad start, 40 acres and a borrowed mule when we married, and she knew exactly what she was agreeing to and agreed to it anyway. We built it to what it is over 20 years. When she died, the land was paid and the buildings were solid and the herd was good quality. She died in the spring, and I buried her on the hill behind the house, where you can see the whole valley. And then I went back to work because the land doesn't stop because you're grieving, and because working it was the only way I knew to still feel her. 11 years. You get used to a shape of life. The silences inside a house stop feeling like silences and just feel like the ordinary texture of time. You stop noticing what's not there after a while, the same way you stop noticing a sound when it's been constant for long enough. I wasn't unhappy. I want to be clear about that. I was a man doing a necessary job well, and I had my work and my land and my routines, and I had the hill where Caroline was, and that was my life, and it was enough. I hadn't carried another person in 11 years. That weight in my arms, that was the first thing in a long time that wasn't the work. I put her on the couch in the front room. There was a quilt there that Caroline made, blue and cream squares, the work of a hard winter when she was laid up with her knee and needed something to do with her hands. I spread it over her. She was shivering, a low, continuous tremor that didn't stop even when I got the quilt over her. I built the fire up without being asked. It was October and the evenings were already mean. And then I went to the kitchen and got water from the pitcher, and I came back. She was watching me, eyes tracking me around the room, taking inventory of what kind of place she'd landed in, what kind of man was moving around in it. I've seen that look before. It's the look of someone who has learned that environments and people need to be assessed quickly, and the assessment better be right. I sat in the chair across from her and set the water on the low table where she could reach it. I said, "How far along are you?" She said, 8 months, near enough. First one. A pause, yes. You got a name. Me Prout. Where'd you come from, me? She looked at the fire. A long time passed, I didn't push it. I'm not a man who fills silences out of discomfort. If a silence needs filling, I fill it. If it doesn't, I leave it. She said, Ridgecroft, about 20 miles east. I knew Ridgecroft. Not much there, a post office, a feed store, maybe 150 families spread thin across the flats going toward the mountains. Hard country with thin soil and wind that never entirely stopped. I said, you walked. Most of it, I had a horse. She went lame about 5 miles back and I left her at a farmhouse. She stopped. I didn't ask, I just left her. I didn't stop to think. I tied her to the post and kept walking. The horse'll be all right. People out here don't mistreat a lame horse left at their gate. They'll doctor her up. She nodded. She wasn't sure about that, but she wanted to believe it. I said, your husband. Nothing for a moment. The fire settled and popped. Outside, the wind picked up and tested the corner of the house, the way it does in October, finding the gaps. She said, dead 3 months ago. I'm sorry. She said, he was not a good man. Flat and plain, no heat in it, just a fact she'd made her peace with a long time before. He was not a good man, and he died owing more than we had, and there were people who came looking for what he owed, and I had nowhere. She stopped. Started again, differently. My mother is in Missouri. I was trying to get to the stage line at Harmon Creek. I thought if I could just get to the stage line, I could get to my mother, and the baby could come there where there was someone who... She stopped again. I said, how long since you ate? She thought about it the way people do when the answer is longer than they want to admit. Yesterday morning. I got up and went to the kitchen. I made eggs from what I had and fried up the last of a ham I'd been working through and some cornbread that was still good from 2 days prior. I wasn't a fancy cook. I was a cook who understood that calories and warmth are what matter and everything else is extra. I put it on a tin plate and I brought it to the low table by the couch and I poured coffee and set that beside it, and then I went back to the kitchen and left her alone with it. That felt right. She didn't need me watching her be hungry. I could hear her eating from the kitchen. Small, careful sounds, the sounds of a person being deliberate because they know they haven't eaten and they need to be slow about it, not stuff themselves, and undo what they're trying to do. After a while, the sounds stopped. I came back in with more coffee and she was sitting up straighter, the plate cleared down to nothing, and some of the grayness had left her face. She still looked worn through, but she looked like a person again rather than a thing that had given up trying. She said, thank you. I said, you can sleep in the back room. There's a proper bed, clean sheets. She said, I don't want to put you out. You're not putting me out. I sleep on the other side of the house. You won't hear me and I won't hear you. She looked at me, the inventory look, but slower now. She was too tired for quick assessments, and the fire had warmed her enough that she'd relaxed a little. She said, I don't know anything about you. I said, no, you don't. You can bar the door from inside if it makes you easier. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, why do you believe people so easily? That surprised me. I said, I don't know that I do. You looked at me and you just picked me up. You didn't ask me anything first. I asked you a few things just now, after you'd already brought me in. I said there are things a person can't fake. You were face down in my yard at dusk, carrying a child, mud on your neck, and your dress worn through at the hem, and your hands cut from where you'd put them down on rough ground. Whatever your situation was, you hadn't chosen it. She looked at the fire again, said quietly, "No, I hadn't." I showed her to the back room. The lamp was in there, and I lit it. The room smelled like cedar and old wool. Caroline had slept in this room through a winter once when she was sick, and I'd been building out the addition to the main room, and sometimes I still thought I could smell something of her in the walls of it, though I knew that was foolish. I'd kept the room clean. I'm a man who keeps things clean, not from any sentiment, but because disorder in a working place costs you time, and time on a ranch is the one thing you never have enough of. Me stood in the doorway looking at the bed, with an expression I've seen on cattle that have walked through a dry stretch and finally smelled water. She said, "I'll be gone in the morning. I won't trouble you past that." I said good night and shut the door. I stood in the hall for a moment. The lamp threw a thin line of light under the door. I listened, but there was nothing to hear. I wasn't troubled. That was what I was checking, whether I was troubled, whether something about this sat wrong. It didn't. What I felt was something closer to the opposite, like a piece of equipment that had been running on one task for a long time and had been handed a different task without warning. Not harder, not worse, just different, and the different required a different kind of attention. I went to bed. I slept fine. In the morning, she was still there. I heard her in the kitchen before I was fully dressed. Careful sounds, the sounds of a person trying to be quiet in a house they don't know, where the boards creak, where the stove door catches, where the latch on the kitchen cupboard sticks and then gives all at once. I came in and she was at the stove with the fire going and the coffee pot on, and she was standing with both hands on the edge of the counter, looking at my provisions shelf. She said without turning, "You're low on flour." I said, "I know. And your salt pork is almost gone." "That too." She turned and looked at me. She'd braided her hair and washed her face, and the dark circles were still there, but she held herself straight, the way women do when they decide not to let their situation show more than it already has. She said, "You said you'd worry about the horse later." I said I did. "It's later." I almost smiled. The horse is fine wherever she is, me. There isn't a family between here and Ridgecroft that would let a lame horse suffer. She'll get doctored up and somebody'll ask around about whose she is, or they'll put her to use in their own yard. Either way, she's all right. She studied me, checking whether that was true or whether I was just saying what was easy. I was telling the truth, and I think she knew it. She said I should go. I've imposed enough. I said, "Sit down and eat breakfast first, and I want to talk to you about something." She looked at me careful. I pulled out a chair at the table and sat down, and after a moment she sat across from me. The morning light came in from the east window, and it was a clear, cold light, and I could see her plainly in it. She was too thin in the face for a woman that close to her time. She'd been walking too long on too little, and her body was giving everything it had to the child, and keeping the thinnest margin for herself. I said, "I don't know what the stage situation is at Harmon Creek right now, but I know it's 30 miles, and I know these roads in October, and I know you're not walking 30 miles. She said I could hire a horse. With what? She said nothing. I said, "I've got a wagon that makes the trip easy enough, but not yet and not in your condition." She said, "I can manage." Me, I kept my voice even. "You can't, and you know you can't, and I'm asking you to be honest about that, at least with yourself." She looked at the table. Her hand went to her belly without her seeming to choose it. I said, "I have a back room. I have more than enough of everything to feed two without noticing it. You stay until the baby comes, you rest, and then I put you on that stage myself when you're ready. That's my offer. You don't owe me anything for it, and I'm not looking for anything in return. It's just what makes sense." Long silence. The coffee pot made sounds on the stove. She said, "And what do you want for it?" "Nothing." She looked up. "I mean that plainly. I'm not a man who trades in those terms. You need shelter, I have it. That's the whole equation." She studied me for a long time. Something in her face did the slow work of deciding. Not whether she believed me, I think she'd already settled that. Something else. Whether she was going to let herself accept it. She said finally, "All right." She didn't go to the stage line. I want to be clear about that. She didn't stay because she had no way to leave. I could have driven her to Harmon Creek when she was ready, and she could have bought her passage and been in Missouri by Christmas, and that would have been the end of the story. That was the plan, and I meant it. What changed, it wasn't me. I want that understood. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Those first weeks were a particular kind of thing. I hadn't had another person under this roof for more than a meal in years. Having someone there changed the shape of every hour in ways I hadn't predicted. The sounds were different. The mornings were different. I'd come in from the barn and there'd be something on the stove and the table would be set, and it was an ordinary thing, a simple thing that people do every day all over the world, but it hit me fresh every morning that first week like something I'd never seen before. Just someone had been up and had thought about it and had done it. I'd forgotten what that was like, receiving something that someone else had thought to do. She was not a complaining woman. She didn't dramatize her condition or ask for things she didn't need. She moved around the house with a careful, practical efficiency, doing what she could and resting when she had to and not apologizing for the resting. She'd figured out in the first day or two that I didn't want apologies, and she'd filed that away and acted on it. She was quick to read a situation. I kept her supplied with wood for the back room, and I went to town twice that first week. Once for the provisions she'd noted, and once to see Doc Alderman, who was the only physician in Garfield and a man who knew how to keep things to himself. I told him what I had, a woman, close to term, no husband, nowhere else. I asked him what to watch for and what to have on hand. He was thorough and he didn't ask questions that weren't medical. He gave me a list of what to keep ready: clean cloth, cord, a knife boiled clean, a few other things. And he told me to send for him the minute she started, day or night, and he'd come. He said first babies were unpredictable. They could be slow or fast and you couldn't tell. And the main job was to stay calm and keep her moving as long as possible and listen to what she told me her body needed. He said I'd learned a lot about birth through the animals. I said I had. He said that was a different thing entirely. I said I knew that. He said good, and we left it at that. He shook my hand firmly when I left, which was his way of saying something he wasn't going to put into words. Her full name was Me Frances Prout, née Calloway. She was from a town in the Missouri Ozarks. The name of it meant nothing to me, one of those small hill towns that don't need to be known past their county lines. Middle daughter of a schoolteacher father, and a mother who kept a kitchen garden so productive that people came from the next town over in August just to buy from it. She'd come west 5 years ago with her husband, a man named Prout. He had what people who are generous call vision, and what I'd call an inability to look at a thing as it actually is rather than as he needed it to be. He'd come with big ideas about land out here, about cattle, about getting in early on what he was certain was going to open up. He'd borrowed to buy acreage with problems he hadn't examined closely before buying. He'd borrowed more to fix the problems. He'd drunk through a substantial portion of what came in when anything came in at all. He'd died owing money to people who weren't patient about collecting. She told me all of this over those weeks, not in one telling, but the way people who have been careful with themselves for a long time start to let things out when they feel safe, a little here and a little there, testing whether the walls held. I listened without giving her the look that says I'm calculating the risk of what I'm hearing. There was no risk to calculate. It was her past, and it was behind her now, and the child was ahead of her, and that was the only direction worth facing. She said to me one evening, maybe 10 days in, "The night's already cold, and the sky hard and clear the way October gets when it's done being uncertain and has committed to winter," she said. "My mother thinks I should have left him sooner." I said, "Mothers aren't usually wrong about those things." She said she never met him. She only knew what I wrote in my letters. "What did you write?" She was quiet for a moment. Then, less than what was true, more than nothing. I nodded. She said, "I kept thinking he'd settle. Some men do. They run hot when they're young and they come to themselves eventually and they become someone you can actually live with." She looked at her hands. "He didn't." I said, "Some don't." "No," a pause. "I am not looking for pity. I want you to know that. I don't think of myself as a sad case." I said, "I know you don't. I made choices. Some of them I'd make differently. But I walked out of that situation on my own 2 feet, and I'm here, and this baby is coming, and I'm going to be fine." I said, "Yes, you are." She looked at me with a direct, questioning look, whether I meant it or just said it to settle her. I meant it and she could see that. She went back to the mending she'd been doing. She'd found a basket of things that wanted attention without being asked: shirts, a pair of trousers, a quilt corner that had pulled away from the binding. And she'd set to them the way she set to everything, quietly and without making an event of it. Her needle moved through the fabric and the fire threw a warm light on her face, and I sat across the room with my boots off reading the almanac, and that was the evening, easy and quiet, and there was nothing wrong with it. About the barn door, I want to tell you about it because it matters. The morning of the fourth day I went out before light, before she was up, and I looked at the splitting bottom rail and I looked at what it would take to fix it. Not much, a good length of board from the stack in the workshop, a handful of nails, maybe 20 minutes of work. I'd been telling myself I'd get to it since August. The way things go on a ranch, the urgent keeps crowding out the important, and a splitting board doesn't fall in the urgent column until the door comes off its hinges on a cold night, and you lose heat you can't get back. I went to the workshop and got the board and the nails and I fixed it, quarter of an hour. I didn't say anything about it to her and she didn't say anything about it to me, not for a long time. The weeks in between settled into something. Not a routine exactly. A routine implies a thing that runs on its own and doesn't require your attention to maintain it. What we had was more deliberate than that. Two people who didn't know each other's habits yet, feeling out what the shape of a shared day looked like when you hadn't arranged it and hadn't expected it. She was up before me most mornings. I'd been waking at 4:30 for 40 years and there she'd already be, the stove going and the coffee on, standing at the window in the pre-dawn dark watching the yard the way a person watches when they're still getting their bearings in a place. I'd come in and she'd move to set a cup on the table without looking up, and I'd sit and drink it, and after a while she'd sit across from me with her own and we'd be quiet together. She wasn't a person who talked in the mornings. Neither was I. It was an accidental compatibility. She asked me one morning out of nothing how deep the well was. I told her 62 feet, dug by hand the second summer we were here, me and a man named Garvey who'd learned the trade somewhere in Ohio and came west with the skill and a weak constitution for cold weather. She asked whether it had ever gone dry and I said no, not in 20 years. The aquifer under this land was reliable even in drought years. She nodded and looked at her coffee. Then she said, "My husband's land had a dry well in '87. We bought water that summer from a man 3 miles over." A pause. It ate what was left of the margin. She wasn't telling me for sympathy. She was telling me the way a person tells you a fact about a situation so you understand the full picture of it. I said I was sorry that happened, and she said it was a while ago now. That was how she was. Not closed, but specific. She said what needed saying and not more than that, and what she said was usually a true thing told plainly. I found I liked that. I hadn't known I'd been missing it. Out here you can go weeks at a time talking mainly to the animals and yourself, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it leaves a kind of crust on your speaking. You get rusty at listening, too, because there's nothing that requires you to truly listen. Me required it. She was the kind of person that if you didn't listen, you'd miss something real. She started reading in the evenings. I had a small shelf of books, almanacs mostly, a Bible, 2 or 3 others I'd had since before the war, and she went through them in a couple of weeks, and then asked me one morning if she could take the wagon to Garfield for the lending library. I said she wasn't taking the wagon anywhere alone in her condition, and that I'd take her when I went in for feed at the end of the week, and she gave me a look that said she didn't appreciate being managed, but she saw the logic and was going to let it go. I took her to Garfield that Friday. I did the feed run and she went to the library, and she came back with 3 books under her arm and a small paper bag of horehound candy that she put on the counter in the kitchen without comment. I ate one that evening without saying anything about it either. The bag was on the counter for a week and a half and neither of us mentioned it, and it slowly emptied. That kind of thing. The first snow came in the second week of November. Light, the kind that doesn't stick at the lower elevations but tells you what's serious about to come. I spent 2 days checking the north fence and moving the herd down from the upper pasture, and me kept the house going while I was out. She had a rhythm in the kitchen by then, practical and unsentimental. She cooked what there was, kept things clean, managed the wood stoves with a competent hand. When I came in the second evening, she had stew on that had been going since noon. She put a bowl in front of me and sat across with her own, and we ate without needing to fill the silence. She said the baby had been moving a lot that day, pushing hard against her ribs on the left side, which was annoying and also reassuring. I said, "That's a sign of a healthy one." She said, "How would you know?" I said, "I've helped with a fair amount of births. Not the same, I know." "Animals?" "Yes." She said dryly, "I'll try not to take offense. What I mean is, a lot of what I know about what a healthy birth looks and sounds and feels like, I learned through doing it enough times. A fair amount of it translates." She thought about that. Then she said, "Are you afraid of it?" I said, "Are you asking whether I'll keep my head?" "I'm asking whether you're afraid." I thought about it honestly. I said, "A little. The same way I'm a little afraid every calving season, not because I don't know what to do, but because there are things that can go wrong that knowing doesn't fix." She nodded. "That's an honest answer." "It's the only kind I have." She looked at her bowl, said quietly, "I'm afraid more than a little." "That makes sense. But I've been afraid of things before and done them anyway." I said, "Yes, I know you have." She looked up. I said, 20 miles, 8 months along, on a horse that went lame. "That's not a small thing, me." She said, 20 miles isn't so far." "Far enough." She didn't answer that, but something in her face changed, a small, barely visible settling around the eyes. I went back to my stew and she went back to hers, and the fire did what fires do, and the wind worked at the north corner of the house, and the evening passed. The night it happened, I'd already been up once. I checked on a young steer who'd been off his feed, went out to the barn around 10, lantern in hand, found him looking better by lantern light than he had by day, which is sometimes how it goes. Came back in, banked the kitchen fire, checked the hall stove, went to bed. Past midnight I heard her. Not a scream. Me was not a screaming woman, and I'd have known that even if I'd known her only an hour. What I heard was a single sharp sound, almost like something dropping off a shelf, and then a silence, and then her voice through the wall, deliberate and controlled. "Mr. Cord." I was up before I was fully awake, boots, lamp in the hall. I opened her door. She was sitting on the edge of the bed with both hands braced on her knees, working through a contraction with a tight, inward stillness that told me she'd been at it for a while before she called out. She looked up at me, and there was no panic in her face. Just the focused, interior attention of a person who has understood what is happening and has made the decision to meet it straight on. She said, "I think it's time." I said, "All right." I got the things Alderman told me to keep ready. I came back and stoked the small stove in her room until it was warm, and I brought water and the clean cloth, and I set everything in easy reach, and she watched me do all of this with that same steady attention. She said, "You don't need to stay." I said, "I'm staying." "There's no reason for you to." "Me." She stopped. I said, "You're not doing this alone." That's the end of that conversation. Something in her shoulders changed by a small degree. Not relaxation, exactly. Something closer to a decision confirmed. She said, "All right. I won't try to describe all of it hour by hour. Some things are too real to be described, not because they're bad, but because no arrangement of words gets near them. What I can tell you is that it was long and it was hard, and she was the strongest person I have ever sat beside. And I've sat beside some men in my time that people wrote songs about." She kept her head through the whole of it. She was afraid. I could see it in the quality of her breathing and in her eyes when a bad one hit. And there were moments when the pain was past a certain point and had its own sound. But she worked through every bit of it with a composure that made me feel like whatever steadiness I was managing to keep in that room, I was keeping it mostly off what I was borrowing from her. There were hours in the middle of the night where the world outside went perfectly still. No wind, no animal sound, nothing. Just the stove and the lamp and the two of us in that room doing the only thing that mattered. I got her water when she asked for it. I told her what I knew and what I was seeing, which wasn't much, but it was what she had, and she seemed to want the telling of it. I held her hand once when she reached for something solid to hold against a bad contraction, and she gripped it hard enough that I felt it in my knuckles for 2 days after, and I was glad to have been there to grip. She asked me once in the deep part of the night, the 3 or 4 in the morning hour when everything is at its most exposed, she said, "Do you think he'll be all right?" I said, "I think so, from what I can see." She said, "You're not just saying that." "No, I'm not a man who says things just to say them, and you know that by now." She looked at me for a moment, Then another contraction came and she went back to the work of it. That was the closest we came to anything tender in all those hours. Not because either of us was withholding it, just because the moment didn't call for anything except what was needed, and what was needed was to stay steady and keep going and be there. At some point, the sky outside the window went from black to gray to a pale, uncertain blue. And then there was a child in the room. I had my hands on him before he made his first sound, and I want to tell you what happened in that moment because it's the truth and I'm not embarrassed by it. When that boy cried for the first time, the sound of it went through me like current through a wire, like something that had been sitting dormant in the walls of this house for a very long time had heard its signal and come on. I'm not a sentimental man, that's not what I'm claiming. I'm telling you what happened in my chest in that specific moment, which was not something I chose and not something I would have predicted. I wrapped him and put him against her, and she looked down at him, and what happened in her face had no name I know for it, and I'm not going to invent one. It wasn't rapture, it wasn't relief, it was something simpler and more fundamental than either. Recognition. Like she'd been expecting this person and was glad he'd finally arrived, even though the trip had been hard. She said without looking up from him, "He's all right." "He's all right." Is he a breath? What do you see? 10 fingers, 10 toes, dark hair, strong lungs, he has opinions about being cold. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. He looks strong, me, he looks like he means it. She put her face down to the top of his head, just stayed there. I cleaned up what I could, and brought her water and clean things, and turned the lamp down a notch, and then I went to the kitchen to give her some quiet. I stood at the kitchen window in the gray first light, and I pressed my palm flat against the cold glass, and I looked out at the yard, the barn with its fixed rail, the mountains going slowly pink and white in the far distance, the frost on everything, the lane empty and still. I stood there for some time. Alderman came out that afternoon. He looked the boy over and he looked me over and he told me I'd done right. He told her she needed 2 weeks of genuine rest and should not be on a stage road before spring. She said, "I can't ask Mr. Cord to keep us that long." Alderman looked at me, I looked at him. I said, "There's nothing to ask, they're staying." She said, "Elias." It was the first time she'd used my first name. I don't know if she noticed. I said 2 weeks is nothing, and spring is not long. You rest and that boy gets a good start and then we'll see what makes sense. That's all. Alderman packed his bag with a careful, professional neutrality on his face that wasn't quite covering a small smile. He said he'd be back in a week, and to send for him if anything changed, and he left. She named the boy Thomas. Thomas Calloway Prout, her mother's family name for the middle, which felt right to her because the Calloways were the part she wanted carried forward. She said Prout could stay on the birth record for practical purposes, but she intended to call him Cal, and she'd see whether it suited him when he got older and had more say in the matter. I watched her with him in those 2 weeks. Not because I decided to, you're doing something else and the watching just happens. I'd come in from the barn or the workshop, and she'd be in the light from the window with him over her shoulder, talking to him in a low, continuous way, telling him what she was looking at, what the sound outside was, what the weather was doing, as if he was someone worth explaining things to. I'd hear that voice through the wall sometimes at night, low and rhythmic, somewhere between talking and not talking, and I'd lie in my room and hear it without choosing to, the way you hear water when a creek runs near where you sleep. It just becomes part of the sound of the house. I'd never had a child in this house. You don't know what that changes until it happens, and then you find that the particular texture of sound you'd been living in, a livable texture, a good enough texture, has shifted into something different. Not better, not worse. Different in a way that keeps catching you when you're not expecting it. There's the obvious things, the crying at 2 in the morning, which I'd expected, and the crying at 4 in the morning, which I'd expected, and the other crying at 6 that I hadn't accounted for. There's the way the lamp burns all night in the back room, so for the first time in 11 years there's a light in that part of the house when I wake and cross the hall to the kitchen. Small things. The kind that would mean nothing individually, and together, amount to an entirely different way of living in a house. What I hadn't expected was the quiet parts, not the sleeping child quiet, but the particular quiet of a woman at peace with where she is. Me, in those 2 weeks of rest, was the most settled version of herself I'd seen, not because she was happy about the circumstances, not because she'd gotten everything she'd wanted, but because she'd come through the worst of it and she was on the other side of it, and the child was whole and she knew where she was. That was a different kind of quiet than the careful, watchful quiet she'd carried in those first October weeks. It was the quiet of someone who has found the ground under them. I noticed it because I was familiar with the other kind. I'd been watching it for 2 months by then, the careful listening quality she had, the way she held herself slightly braced even when she was at rest. And then one afternoon I came in from the barn and she was in the chair by the fire with Cal asleep on her chest, and she was simply there, not watching the door, not taking inventory of anything, and I stopped for a moment in the hall and looked at it and thought, there it is. She's all right. I built a cradle. I had the wood and I had the tools, and I'd been telling myself I'd get to it and then not getting to it. Then one morning I went out to the workshop and I started it and had it done by evening. I didn't tell her I was going to do it. I put it in her room when it was finished. She came to the doorway of the workshop sometime in the afternoon and stood watching for a while without saying anything, and then went back inside. When I brought the cradle in, she had it set up beside the bed before I was back from washing my hands. She said, looking at it, "It's good work." I said, "It's a cradle." She said, "Good work is good work. You don't have to argue with it." Spring came the way it does out here, slow and unreliable, a warm week and then a hard frost, then another warm week, the land not ready to commit. The lane thawed and froze and thawed again. The stage line at Harmon Creek would have been running by April, maybe mid-April. Neither of us talked about Missouri. There's a kind of understanding that doesn't need speaking. Speaking it would make it less true somehow, not more. Everything that had accumulated between us over those months had its own weight and its own clarity, and it didn't need to be put in language to be real. But me was not a woman who let important things rest on implication indefinitely. She was a woman who let things sit until she was sure, and then she said them. One evening in the second week of March, Cal in the back room, the fire low and good, the last of the daylight going out the west window, she said, "Elias." I looked up. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me plain." I said, "All right." She said, "What do you want?" "In what regard?" She said, "In regard to this. In regard to what happens next." She looked at her hands on the table. "You've kept us all winter, and you've asked nothing for it, and you delivered my child, and you built a cradle, and you've never once made me feel like I owed you anything. And I know you said it was just the math of it, but it can't only be math. People aren't only math, so I'm asking you what you want." I set down the cup I was holding. I said, "I'm not asking you to stay me, if that's what you're worried I'm getting to." She said, "That's not what I'm worried about." "What are you worried about?" "I'm not worried, I'm asking a question." I said, "I want you and Cal on a stage in good health going where you're going." I meant that when I said it, and I still mean it. She nodded, looked at the table. Let a moment pass. Then she said, "What if I don't want to go?" The fire settled, the wind moved outside. I said, "What?" She said it again with the same even voice. "What if Missouri is somewhere I came from and not somewhere I'm going to?" I looked at her. She looked back, no angle to it, no performance. This was me asking a plain question in her plain way, with her whole attention on it. She said, "I'm not a romantic woman. I've been married to a romantic man, and I know what that costs and what it's worth, which is not much. I'm asking you a practical question." I said, "And what is the question exactly?" She said, "Would you want us here? Not as an arrangement, not because of what you did for us and what I might owe you for it. She stopped. "I don't have a clean word for what I mean." I said, "I know what you mean." She waited. I said, "I think I would want that. Yes, but I need you to be sure of it. A woman who decides something that large in a winter she spent in a stranger's." She said, "I didn't decide it this winter." I looked at her. "I decided it in the first week, around the third or fourth day." A pause. "When I came in from the yard and the bottom rail on the barn door was fixed." I was quiet. She said, "You'd been staring at it before I came. I could tell it was a thing that had been waiting. And then a few days after I arrived it was done, and you never mentioned it, and you weren't the kind of man who'd have mentioned it. You just fixed it because it needed fixing. That's when I knew what kind of man you were." She looked at me. "I've been sitting with it ever since to be certain I was right." I said, "And you're certain?" She said, "I'm certain." We didn't talk about it again for several days. Nothing needed adding. The thing had been said, and it was real, and it didn't need to be picked up and examined every hour. Neither of us was built for that. I want to try to say something about those days just after March going into April, because they had a quality I'd never experienced before, and I'm not sure I can get at it precisely, but I want to try. I had lived alone for 11 years, I've said that. In that time, I'd become very practiced at a particular kind of self-sufficiency that extends beyond the practical, beyond knowing how to cook and fix a fence and doctor an animal. You become self-sufficient in your own company. You learn to be the person who decides everything without consulting, who plans without conferring, who manages his own mood because there's no one else to manage it with and no one else to be affected by it. You don't notice that you've become this way until something interrupts it. What interrupted it was not the conversation at the supper table. It was what came after, the specific feeling of knowing that the decisions I was making were no longer solely mine. The fence on the north section that was going to need significant work in spring. The question of whether to cut the herd this year or hold, whether to put the east pasture in corn or hay. I'd have made those decisions alone without a second thought. Now I found myself in the odd moments in the barn or lying awake before 4, going through the logic of them in a way that anticipated someone else's view, not asking her yet, just making room for the question. The way you shift to the side of a trail when you hear someone coming. I hadn't known I was going to feel that. I hadn't known that was something I was missing. She was changing too, but her changes were different. She was gaining ground week by week, physically. She'd been thin in the face all winter, and now that was filling back, the color coming in, the strength returning to how she moved. But the other changes were more particular. She stopped addressing me as Mr. Cord entirely, without ceremony, somewhere in early March, and I only noticed after. She started leaving her book on the kitchen table when she went to bed, which meant it was there in the morning, and I'd find myself looking at the cover over my coffee. A small, incremental claiming of space, not aggressive, just she was settling in, putting her roots down in the way that people do when they've decided a place is theirs. What I felt watching that was something very plain and very hard to say. I felt necessary. Not in the way the land makes you necessary. The land will make demands of any man willing to work it, and there's nothing personal in that. This was the other kind. The kind that has a particular face attached to it, and a particular voice asking what you know about the North Water, and whether the steer had come all the way back to himself. That kind of necessary goes into a different part of a man, a part that had been empty for 11 years. That's what I want to say about those days. What changed was the days themselves. The mornings had a different quality. She started asking about the ranch in earnest, the herd, the east pasture, the water rights, what I paid for hay when I had to buy it, where I ran short and where I was comfortable. Not making conversation. Trying to understand the things she had decided to be part of. She had a fast, practical mind, and she could read the arithmetic of a situation without needing it explained twice. She looked out at the east pasture one afternoon through the kitchen window and said, "What happened to that field?" I said, "Nothing happened, it's just fallow." "Why is it fallow?" "It takes 2 people to work it right, one to drive the lead team and one to handle the second. I've been one person." She nodded, looking at the field. Then she said, "Well, I'm here now," and went back to what she was doing and didn't make a production of it. May, the east pasture, turned and seated. 3 long days of it, me working the teams side by side, Cal in a sling at her front. And by the 3rd day, she was driving the second team herself because I'd shown her how, and she'd picked it up the way she picked everything up straightforwardly, without making it more or less than it was. The 3rd afternoon, teams put up. I was at the water trough washing the grime off my face and hands. Me came and stood beside me. The sun was dropping behind the western ridge, and the field behind us was dark with new earth, and the smell of turned ground was in the air. She said, "I wrote to my mother." I looked at her. I told her I wasn't coming, that I'd found a place and I was staying. I dried my face on my shirt sleeve. She asked whether I was certain. I told her I was. I said, "Is she all right with that?" "She's coming in July to see for herself." Me almost smiled. She said she wants to meet the man who fixed the board. I may have told her about the board. I said, "You told her about the board." I told her you were a man who fixed things without making a sermon of it, and that was enough for her. A small pause. It was enough for me too, Elias. We stood there by the water trough in the late afternoon, the teams blowing in the barn behind us, Cal asleep in the house, the seeded field going dark between the furrows, and she reached over and took my hand. Just that, she wasn't looking at me when she did it. She was looking at the field, at the work we'd put into it, at what it would be. Her hand was strong and her grip was firm, and she held on. I held back. The evening came down over everything, and the mountains went their colors, and we stood there until the first star came through, and neither of us said anything, and neither of us needed to. I want to say one thing about what that summer was, before I tell you the evening. It was the first summer in 11 years that the ranch was not just mine. That sounds simple, and it is simple, but what it meant in practice was a continuous daily thing that I kept encountering fresh. The east field that was corn by July instead of grass gone to seed. Me's kitchen garden behind the house. She'd put it in herself in May, a serious-sized plot, working the soil in the mornings before the heat came on, Cal in a basket at the row's end. Tomatoes, beans, squash, herbs I didn't know the names of. She knew what she was doing. The garden by midsummer was producing so much we were putting things up, filling jars that stood in ranks on the pantry shelf that had been nearly empty the October she arrived. The jars, I keep coming back to the jars. There is something about a pantry that's full and organized, that someone has worked at and thought about and put up against the winter. That says a thing about the permanence of a situation. I'd been living out of a pantry that was functional and thin for 11 years, buying what I needed and no more, because there was no point in excess when you're one person, and a person alone tends to let things go before they use them. The jars were me saying, without saying it, we are here and we will be here, and we are putting up for the winter and the winter after that. Her mother came in July, a small, straight woman named Edith Calloway, who stepped off the stage at Harmon Creek with a traveling case and a look on her face that said she would be making assessments, and those assessments would be honest ones. I drove out to get her. We rode back mostly in silence, which she seemed to find acceptable. She asked me 3 direct questions: how long I'd had the land, whether it was paid, what I grew. And I answered all 3 directly, and she said nothing further until we got to the ranch. She looked at the house, she looked at the barn. She looked at the east field in the late afternoon light, the corn standing well, and the kitchen garden visible past the corner of the house. She looked at me, who was on the porch with Cal on her hip, and me looked at her, and something passed between them that I had no part of and no business having any part of. Then Edith Calloway looked at me, a long, deliberate look the way her daughter had that first night in the firelight, and she said, "She tells me you fixed a board." I said, "The bottom rail on the barn door. It needed doing." She said, and then she went up the porch steps and took the baby. She stayed 10 days. She helped put up the late tomatoes. She and me talked for hours in the kitchen after I'd gone to bed, low and continuous, the sound of it barely reaching me. When I drove her back to the stage, she shook my hand firmly, like aldermen had, and said to take care of them. I said I would. She said, "I know you will," and she got on the stage. There's a summer evening I come back to, not because it was the biggest thing or the most dramatic. I've told you about those already. I come back to this one because it was completely, simply true. Cal was 7 months old. He'd figured out how to sit up on his own a few weeks before and was still pleased about it in the way babies are pleased when they discover a new thing their body will do. Me had him out on the porch in the last hour of light, both of them on a blanket, Cal doing the hard work of sitting and being interested in everything, me reading something she'd borrowed from the lending library in Garfield. I came up from the barn and stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. She looked up from the book. The gray picked up a stone, left front. "I know I got it out." She nodded, "Dinner's keeping." "Give me 10 minutes." "Take your time." She went back to her book. Cal looked at me from the blanket with his expression of comprehensive interest in the world. He held out one hand in my general direction. I went up the steps and held out a finger, and he grabbed it in both of his and tried to eat it, which was his habit. And I stood there a moment with my hand occupied, and the last light on the porch and me's voice explaining to him what she was reading, in the easy, assuming way she talked to him, as if he was someone worth explaining things to. I went inside and washed my hands, and I stood at the kitchen window for a moment before I went back out. I looked at the 2 of them through the glass, the last of the sun on them. The east field in the middle distance, shoulder high and full, the corn we'd put in together, green and going gold at the tips in the evening. The barn standing where it had always stood, solid and tended. The lane out to the road and the mountains beyond it. All of it mine, all of it whole. All of it provided for not as a circuit that fed only itself anymore, but as something with people in it. Something that was for something. A man of 63 who had been keeping this place going alone for 11 years. No flash to him, no fortune. His idea of sentiment was to fix what needed fixing without talking about it. A woman had looked at that man and had seen something in him worth staying beside. She had decided it on her own in the first week, before she had any obligation to stay, before anything had passed between them that would have made it an exchange. She had decided it because of who she was and who she'd seen him to be, and then she had sat with it for months to be sure, and when she was sure she had said it plainly, the way she said everything. She stayed, not because she had to, because she chose to. That's the whole of it, I think. That's the thing underneath all the rest of it. There's a difference between being needed because there's no other option and being chosen because someone looked at you clearly and decided you were the one. The first I'd had for 11 years, the ranch needed me, the herd needed me, the fences needed me. But that's not the same as a woman who has looked at you in the morning light and in the long evenings, and through the hard night in October when you were the only steady thing in the room, and decided, this one. This is the one. I went back out to the porch. Me put dinner on the table when the light finally went. Cal had opinions about the evening, and we let him have them. The lamp burned down, and we let it. Outside, the dark came across the valley the way it has always come and always will, slow and full and indifferent to the small lit thing in the middle of it. We were not indifferent. We were right here,